welcome to a bonus episode of the History of Cities. In this special episode, I would like to take a break from our narrative on the history of Byzantium to travel into the realm of fiction and explore some of my favorite cities in J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings books. I want to go over some of the most interesting cities for each of the three major races of Middle-earth. I hope to touch on what makes each of these cities unique as we go through their stories from start to finish. We should of course start with...
The elves, immortal, wisest, and fairest of all beings.
This will be the longest section of this episode, as the elves were the firstborn and the first of the races to inhabit Middle-earth, so they naturally built the most cities. On top of the numerical superiority, the elves also possessed an advantage in quality, though many of the other races will give them a run for their money in the later ages of Middle-earth. At the dawn of their creation, the elves were split into three houses, the Noldor, the Teleri, and the Vanyar. Of these, the House of Noldor were by far the most ambitious and proactive. For this reason, most of the cities we will discuss will be cities built by the Noldor elves in Middle-earth, from which they sought to be the supreme rulers of its realms. Before diving into the world of Middle-earth, I want to briefly mention the two elven cities in the undying lands of Valinor. These were Tirion, home of the Noldor, and Alcolande, home of the Falmari, a sect of the Teleri. These two cities were more splendid than any built in Middle-earth, and would be the template which many tried to emulate as they built their capitals on the eastern continent. Now we will begin with our first elven capital in Middle-earth, in the land of Doriath. This was the home of the king of the Sindarin, or elves who had not journeyed to Valinor, and it was named Menegroth. Unlike the stereotype that has elves living in wooded areas and dwarves cloistered in deep, dark caverns, Menegroth was an elven stronghold built into the side of a ravine with the help of the dwarves. Though they did not want to stray too far from the stereotype, and so the walls were decorated with elaborate carvings of trees and animals. This city was a beautiful example of the kinship between elves and dwarves, before the falling out of the two races, and both lived together in harmony under the rule of one of the original elven lords, Thingol. Thingol was a cautious and reserved king, especially compared to his more bombastic and haughty Noldorian kin, the descendants of Finwë. The Sindarin king kept his kingdom isolated from the strife brought by the Noldor in their search for the Silmarils, and only interacted with the elves from Nargothrond, a city we will discuss in the future. However, he was not able to avoid the doom of the sons of Feanor forever. Trouble began when a man named Beren stumbled into the lands around Menegroth. While he wandered blindly through Thingol's realm, Beren ran into his daughter, Luthien. Beren was instantly entranced by her beauty and pleaded with Thingol to let him marry her. Thingol was not about to let his only daughter be married to a lowly mortal, but he did not want to refuse Beren outright, and so he gave his permission on the condition that Beren bring him a Silmaril from the crown of Morgoth. This task was obviously impossible, but Thingol had no idea that this demand was the first pebble to fall in the avalanche that would eventually destroy him, Menegroth, and the friendship between elves and dwarves. To make a very long story short, Beren of course triumphed against the odds, and with the help of Luthien was able to bring back a Silmaril to Menegroth. These stones were beyond words in splendor, but they carried with them a terrible curse. Thingol was unaware of this curse, and requisitioned a group of dwarves to set the Silmaril into a beautiful necklace called the Noglamir. When the dwarves completed this task, they were overcome by the beauty of what they had made, and killed Thingol so that they could keep the necklace for themselves. This sparked a war between the elves of Doriath and the dwarves of Nogrod. In the ensuing battle of the 1,000 Caves, Menegroth was sacked, and the elves of Doriath were scattered. The Silmaril wound up back in the hands of Beren, who gave it to his wife Luthien. When Luthien died, the Silmaril then passed to her son Dior, who now ruled from his grandfather's throne in Menegroth. The sons of Feanor saw the stone as their rightful property, and swore death upon any who stood in defiance of this claim. This caused conflict between the sons and the inhabitants of Menegroth, which resulted in the Second Kinslaying, where Menegroth was destroyed. The Silmaril slipped from the sons of Feanor's grasp, however, and eventually made its way to the hands of the half-elf Eärendil, who spirited it away to Valinor, where it passed beyond the reach of any man, dwarf, or elf. Here the story of Menegroth ends, and we will move on to its sister city, the Noldor capital of Nargothrond. Nargothrond was founded and ruled by a noble lord of the Noldor named Finrod Filigund, who was nephew of Feanor and brother of Galadriel. Finrod did not share his uncle's arrogance or his insatiable hunger for the Silmarils, and initially opposed the High King when he called the Noldor to travel to Middle-earth in search of the precious stones. But he eventually followed his people in their journey east. While traveling Beleriand, Finrod came to Doriath and was welcomed by Thingol, despite the fact that the Sindarin king disliked the warmongering Noldor. Thingol could see that Finrod was of a gentler nature and invited him to stay a while in Menegroth. Finrod was smitten and inspired by the beauty of the Thousand Caves, and driven by his desire to rule over his own realm in Middle-earth, resolved to build his own underground city. With the help of the dwarves, he carved out a great city near the banks of the river Narog. The dwarves were enamored with Finrod's grace and kindness, and bestowed upon him two gifts. First, the necklace Noglamir, which we know will come to have a great yet tragic story, and secondly, the honorary epithet, Filigund, which means Hewer of Caves. Under the just rulership of Finrod, Nargothrond became one of the mightiest elven strongholds in Middle-earth, but avoided directly engaging the forces of Morgoth. Instead, they took a middle road between open warfare and the isolationism of Doriath, where they secretly attacked bands of orcs that passed through their territory. The rule of Finrod would last for over 300 years, until he joined Beren on his quest for a Silmaril, and gave his nephew Orodreth temporary overlordship of Nargothrond. Finrod was slain by Sauron during this quest, and Orodreth became the new permanent ruler of his city. During his reign, a great human warrior by the name of Turin came to Nargothrond. Turin persuaded Orodreth into pursuing a more open war with the forces of Morgoth, and thus brought the city into the crosshairs of the enemy. Many elves were rightfully apprehensive of this change in policy, but Turin urged them to continue their fight against Morgoth. The great enemy could not endure the existence of such a powerful elven realm, and so he sent a massive horde of orcs under the command of a terrible dragon named Glaurung to destroy the city. The elves valiantly met the orcs in open battle, but were utterly destroyed, and Orodreth was slain. The remaining inhabitants of Nargothrond either fled or were killed, and Glaurung took the city as his prize. Turin was distraught by the horror he had brought to his friends, and tried to slay Glaurung, but was petrified by a spell that the dragon cast on him. Instead of killing Turin, Glaurung let him go so that he would be tormented for the rest of his life, knowing that he could not avenge Nargothrond. But 5 years later, the dragon changed his mind and sought out Turin to end his suffering. Turin waited for Glaurung in a shallow ravine, and when the dragon passed over him, he drove his sword into his soft underbelly, slaying the beast. This left Nargothrond empty of any inhabitants and ripe for the taking. First, the petty dwarf Mim claimed the city in the name of his ancestors, who had originally dwelt in the caverns that had become Nargothrond. But he was later slain by Turin's father, Hurin, who left all the treasures of the city alone, except for the necklace Noglamir, which we know he took to Menegroth. Nargothrond remained empty until the War of Wrath, in which it sank into the sea with the rest of Beleriand. We will now move on to the last elven city in Beleriand, and quite possibly the greatest city to ever be built in Middle-earth. Around the time that Finrod founded Nargothrond, his cousin Turgon began receiving dreams from Ulmo, the Lord of Waters, directing him towards a ring of mountains that hid a large open plain. Turgon decided to build a city on a hill at the center of the plain that would become a safe haven for his people and shield them from the evil of the world. And so the elves set to building a great city, modeled after their old home in Valinor, Tirion. This city would be named Gondolin, which is Sindarin for Hidden Rock. The city they built was high up on a hill, with gleaming white walls and an awe-inspiring tower from which the king could look over his realm. We will explore another great city later on in this episode that bears striking similarity to this description. The mountains surrounding Gondolin made its name fitting, as it was indeed well hidden from the forces of Morgoth. In fact, he had absolutely no idea that over a third of the Noldoran population lived in that area. In order to keep the city secret and safe, Turgon forbade anyone from leaving the Ring of Mountains. But his sister grew restless, and one day she slipped out to explore the world. she returned over 80 years later with a son that she had born to a dark elf. Her son was named Maeglin, and he would eventually be the source of ruin for the great city. But for now, he was welcomed by his uncle Turgon and joined the lords of Gondolin. The isolation of Gondolin allowed them to live peacefully through some of the most tumultuous centuries of Middle-earth, and they prospered. Even though his older brother Fingon was High King of the Noldor, Turgon's realm was by far the most beautiful and glorious of the elven kingdoms. Yet still it remained hidden from the world, until a great battle called the Dagor Bragollach, or Battle of Sudden Flame, forced two men to flee into the foothills around the Ring of Mountains. The eagles that patrolled and protected the mountain brought the two men to Turgon, who against his better judgment allowed them to leave as long as they swore to never tell anyone about the secret elven city. But the sudden disappearance and then reappearance of the men caused people to begin questioning whether there was more to this impassable mountain range than met the eye. Eventually, these rumors reached Morgoth, who deduced that there was a great elven stronghold hidden there, but he did not yet know how to get to it. Turgon felt torn between his responsibility of keeping Gondolin safe and isolated, with his responsibility to aid his kin in their fight. He was forced to take a more active role in the wars of the elves and orcs, and led a large force to aid his brother in the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. In this battle, the alliance of elves, men, and dwarves suffered heavily, and Fingon was slain, making Turgon the new High King of the Noldor. His new title made Turgon the primary target of the now ascendant enemy, who made finding and destroying Gondolin his top priority. At this time, a great hero of men named Tuor was guided to the city by one of Turgon's mariners. Tuor was the son of one of the men that had previously been guests in Gondolin, and so he was too welcomed in. Tuor fell in love with and married Turgon's daughter Idril, which greatly angered Maeglin, who had secretly coveted his cousin. This was the first domino to fall that would eventually lead to the destruction of Gondolin. The second domino came soon after, when one of the men who had previously visited Gondolin and had been a prisoner of Morgoth since the Battle of Unnumbered Tears was let go. He tried to seek refuge in Gondolin, but could not find the secret entrance again. But the agents of Morgoth that had followed him learned the general location of Gondolin. The elves in Middle-earth had suffered tragedy after tragedy since the Battle of Sudden Flame, and soon, as Menegroth and Nargothrond had fallen, Gondolin was the only great elven stronghold left in Beleriand. At this time, Maeglin wandered too far outside the protection of the city and was captured by orcs. They brought him to Morgoth, and Maeglin was motivated by fear of torture and resentment at being spurred by Idril to give up the exact location and weaknesses of Gondolin. What followed was the greatest tragedy of the First Age, an age that was noted for having a lot of great tragedies. I will not go into great detail about the siege and fall of Gondolin, but the gist of it is that many great elves lost their lives, and the greatest city in all of Middle-earth was lost forever. The fall of Gondolin brought the elves to their darkest moment, and in their desperation, they appealed to the Valar to come to Middle-earth to overthrow Morgoth's evil once and for all. Their response was an all-out assault on Morgoth's armies in Beleriand that resulted in the enemy's destruction, but also the destruction of Beleriand. Much of the western lands of Middle-earth sank into the ocean, and thus the great elven cities of the First Age could never be recovered. We have now covered 3 of the elven cities of the First Age, and so we should balance it out with 3 more cities from later ages. It should be noted that after the destruction of Beleriand, many of the elves were invited to return to Valinor, and most of them did. For this reason, many of the later kingdoms of the elves are greatly reduced in splendor compared to their predecessors. There will never be cities that rival those of the First Age, except maybe one. But anyway, on to the home of the great elven smith, Celebrimbor, creator of the Rings of Power. Celebrimbor lived in and would eventually craft the objects that would be the impetus of the Second and Third Age in the city of Ost-in-Ithil, in the elven realm of Eregion. The realm of Eregion was founded by Galadriel and her husband Celeborn as they moved east in the Second Age after the sundering of Beleriand. In their new realm, they built the city of Ost-in-Ithil near a road that led to the western gate of the great dwarven city of Khazad-dûm, which we will discuss later in this episode. The proximity of this city to the master dwarf craftsmen and the fact that it was home to the elven crafts guild led by Celebrimbor quickly grew the renown of Ostinhetil. In fact, the renown of Celebrimbor grew so that it eclipsed the city and even the Lady Galadriel. But unlike many other great elven craftsmen, Celebrimbor was not tainted by pride or selfish greed. He shared his gifts with the elves of Ostinhetil, and he even cultivated a warm friendship with the dwarves of Khazad-dûm. In particular, his friendship with the dwarven smith Narvi produced the Doors of Durin that allowed elves, men, and dwarves to enter the realm under the Misty Mountains, as long as they spoke friend. But the most famous objects to come from Ostinhetil are the rings that Celebrimbor made with the help of the Giver of Gifts, also known as Annatar. While Celebrimbor was not prideful by nature, he was seduced by the promise that Annatar gave him, that he could create something that rivaled the Silmarils that had been created by Celebrimbor's grandfather, Feanor. With the help of Annatar, the city of Ostinhetil became the birthplace of 16 Rings of Power. It is proof that Celebrimbor still held his selfless and generous nature, as the first rings that he crafted were intended not for himself or his kin, but for the race of men and dwarves, as gifts. But these 16 rings were tainted by the magic of Annatar, who was in reality Sauron in disguise. When this deception was discovered by Celebrimbor, Sauron was ejected from Ostinhetil, and the rings were hidden away. Sauron slunk away, back to Mordor, to craft his one ring, and in the meantime, Celebrimbor made 3 more rings in secret. These he gave to great elven lords for safekeeping. When Sauron completed his master ring and put it on, he and the elven lords immediately became aware of each other. The existence of these rings that opposed him sent Sauron into a red-hot rage and sparked the War of the Elves and Sauron. Ostinhetil and Celebrimbor would be casualties in this war, and the city would never be rebuilt, even after the defeat of Sauron. We will now move on to 3 short sections on important elven havens. These havens were beautiful, magical, and safe, but they did not match the splendor and glory of any of the great elven cities. The first of these we must mention are the Grey Havens. The Grey Havens were located in the elven realm of Lindon. This was the westernmost portion of Middle-earth, after the sinking of Beleriand, and was where most of the Noldor elves relocated to after the War of Wrath. The Havens were ruled by a Sindarin elf named Círdan, but he was happy to share his city and his realm with the High King of the Noldor, Gil-galad, and his people. It is from the Grey Havens that elves began to slowly leave Middle-earth to return to Valinor. The number of elves that left greatly increased during the War of the Elves and Sauron, in which the realm of Eregion was destroyed. Shortly after, the elves of Lindon joined the last alliance of elves and men to defeat Sauron. The War of the Last Alliance saw the death of Gil-galad, and afterwards even more elves made the journey back to Valinor. The Grey Havens is a bittersweet place in Middle-earth. As a safe haven of the elves, it was doubtlessly beautiful and full of great music and food, but it is also the last place that many elves and a few other great heroes ever set foot in Middle-earth. Unlike every other place we have mentioned so far, the havens were never destroyed. They allowed elves and heroes to pass into the west well into the Fourth Age, until eventually Celeborn and Círdan took the last ship together and it was abandoned. It was a place of saying goodbye, a place of endings, but also a place of new beginnings. The second haven we will go over is one of the most prominently discussed in The Lord of the Rings. This is of course Imladris, or more commonly, Rivendell. As the War of the Elves and Sauron raged on in the Second Age, Gil-galad sent his chief lieutenant and a sizable elven army to aid his kin in Eregion. They were too late to prevent the destruction of Ostinhetil and the sacking of Eregion, but they did manage to meet up with Celeborn and a group of elves who were fleeing north. The combined forces of elves were still not enough to match the hosts of Sauron, so they were forced to retreat further north, and at the head of the river Bruinen, Elrond founded the safe haven of Rivendell. The elven stronghold was soon flooded by refugees fleeing Sauron's armies, who were hot on their heels. Soon, Rivendell was surrounded and besieged. Elrond managed to hold out until a combined force of elves, led by Gil-galad, and men of Númenor, defeated Sauron on the battlefield and lifted the siege. After the defeat of Sauron, Elrond decided to stay in Rivendell to provide safe haven for elves and any friends of elves. When Gil-galad died, it seemed like Elrond might be the next logical choice to be High King of the Noldor, but he recognized that the elves' time in Middle-earth was coming to an end, and appointing another king might make some elves want to stay, even though it might not be in their best interests. For this reason, Elrond remained the humble lord and host of Rivendell, but still provided aid and advice to any friends who came to him. In the Third Age, Rivendell became the home of the heirs of Isildur, the great men known as the Dunedain. These men were descendants of Elrond's mortal brother Elros, and he treated them like family, helping raise and tutor many future chieftains of the Northern Rangers. This relationship between Elrond and the Dunedain became more vital when the Northern Kingdom of Men fell to the Witch King of Angmar. The Witch King was the most direct threat to Rivendell's safety since the fall of Sauron in the Second Age, and so Elrond was forced to leave his haven to join an elven coalition to oust him. After removing this threat, Rivendell was once again relatively safe, and Elrond was able to play host to many great heroes of the Third Age. First was Aragorn, heir of Isildur, who was taken to Rivendell by his mother after his father died when he was only 2 years old. Here he was raised and educated by Elrond, but was not told who his father was or what made him so special. Then, 10 years later, a hobbit named Bilbo Baggins, 13 dwarves, and a wizard named Gandalf stopped in Rivendell on their way to the Lonely Mountain. Nearly 80 years later, Bilbo's nephew Frodo brought the One Ring to Rivendell. It is here that the Council of Elrond convened to determine what the fate of the ring should be. From all across Middle-earth, heroes were summoned to Imladris. Here they decided to destroy the ring in the fires of Mount Doom, and the Fellowship of the Ring departed the last homely house. The success of their quest and the destruction of the One Ring removed the power of the Elven Ring that Elrond had been using to keep Rivendell safe in secret. With the fading of their power, Elrond and most of the elves of Rivendell departed for Valinor, and the haven gradually disappeared. The last elven haven we will discuss is Galadriel's realm of Lothlorien. The land that Galadriel would eventually come to rule was first inhabited by elves who had stayed behind in Middle-earth when the elves were first invited to go to Valinor. They called the woods between Fangorn and Mirkwood Lorinend. These first elves fled their initial settlement when the dwarves of Khazad-dûm first came to prominence. This settlement was eventually re-inhabited by Sylvan elves that had fled the fall of Beleriand. The new elves joined with the old elves, and together they became the Galadrim, or Tree People. Their first leader was a Sindarin elf named Amdir, who established friendly ties with the elves of Eregion and the dwarves of the Misty Mountains. Because of this friendship between elven realms, it was to Lothlorien that Galadriel and many of her kin fled after the fall of Eregion. She brought with her the elven ring of power named Nenya, which allowed Lothlorien to remain secret and secure from the forces of evil. Despite their secrecy and security, the elves of Lothlorien did not remain isolated, and when they were called upon to join the last alliance of elves and men, they did not refuse. In the subsequent war of the last alliance, many Galadrim, including Amdir, died. His son Amroth became the new king of Lothlorien, but he was unhappy with Middle-earth in general. When the dwarven realm of Khazad-dûm fell to a Balrog later in the Third Age, the security of Lothlorien was shaken, and Amroth took this as a sign that his people should no longer stay in the woods. And so the king gave up his throne and led many of his people out of the forest. In his absence, Celeborn and Galadriel became Lord and Lady of the Galadrim. Galadriel then planted seeds that had been given to her by Gil-galad, which he had carried all the way from Valinor. From these seeds grew the great golden Malorn trees that were unlike anything else in Middle-earth. It is because of these trees that Lothlorien was considered the most beautiful realm in Middle-earth, and the Galadrim defended it fiercely. For over 1,000 years after Galadriel and Celeborn took charge, the realm remained untouched by outsiders, until the Fellowship of the Ring arrived at their borders. This marked the beginning of a dark and troubling time for Lothlorien. No longer was the haven to be ignored by the forces of darkness, and during the War of the Ring they endured 3 attacks from the corrupted fortress of Dol Guldur. Despite the fact that the Galadrim repulsed all 3 attacks, and were then able to expel all the corruption from Dol Guldur and Mirkwood, their home did not survive for much longer after the destruction of the One Ring. The loss of Galadriel's Ring of Power meant the gradual fading away of that most wondrous elven home. By the time that Galadriel's granddaughter Arwen passed away in the year 121 of the Fourth Age, there was no one left in Lothlorien. It is here that we draw our discussion on the elven cities and havens of Middle-earth to a close. Despite the power and majesty of the elves, their strongholds were not as immortal as their souls. Whether they met their end in cataclysmic horror or gradually faded away, by the end of Tolkien's writing, there are no more elven homes east of the Great Sea. However, there are still places I wish to go over, as we have yet to hear of the deeds and homes of the two other great races of Middle-earth. And so, now comes the race of
The Dwarf Lords, great miners and craftsmen of the mountain halls.
We will start with a brief history of the creation of dwarves and an explanation of one of their most sacred holds. Unlike the elves and men, dwarves were not children of the supreme being Eru-Ilúvatar. Instead, they were sculpted out of the earth by the lesser god Aue. Because only Ilúvatar could grant free will, these first 7 dwarves were more like extensions of Aue's own spirit. Despite the fact that they lacked the souls that men and elves had, these dwarves were made an approximate image of these races. They were shorter and stockier, as well as a bit rougher looking, but they had a strong willpower and shared Aue's love of creating things with their hands. When Ilúvatar first found out that Aule had defied his wishes and created his own living beings, he was initially angry. However, when Aule sought to fix his mistake by destroying the dwarves, Ilúvatar took pity on them and gave them the free will that he had granted to his own children. The dwarves, however, would not be permitted to precede the elves, who Ilúvatar had planned to be the first to awaken his realm, and so they were put to sleep and buried deep within Middle-earth until they would awake after the coming of the elves. The first to awake, eldest, and the only one to be buried without a mate, was the father of the Longbeards, also known as Durin the First. Durin awoke under Mount Gundabad, at the northern end of the Misty Mountain Range. Mount Gundabad became the first home of the dwarves, and because of their reverence towards their father Durin, it also became one of their holiest sites. The dwarves occupied the mountain for thousands of years, while the elves traveled across Middle-earth to Valinor, and then back to Middle-earth to wage war on Morgoth. All the while, the dwarves mined and crafted, and built even as darkness spread over Middle-earth. They did not worry too much about the wars between the elves and Morgoth, and were content and happy at Gundabad. That was until the Second Age of Middle-earth, when an army of orcs under the command of Morgoth's lieutenant and successor Sauron invaded from the north and conquered Mount Gundabad. The dwarves were not able to expel the orcs from their sacred halls until Sauron was defeated by the last alliance and the One Ring disappeared from the world. Even after purifying the birthplace of Durin's folk, the dwarves would not be able to maintain consistent control of the mountain. Again in the Third Age, a horde of orcs pushed them out. The twice now loss of their beloved homes stoked the fires of hatred in the dwarves' hearts. After the dragon Smaug drove them from their home under the Lonely Mountain, the dwarves' hatred boiled over, and they resolved to remove the scourge of orcs from all of their lost holds in the Misty Mountains. They began at Gundabad, and worked their way south until they finally cleansed Moria. But the price of the destruction of the orcs was too great, and the dwarves that were left could not effectively hold all of their strongholds, and thus Gundabad fell back into the hands of the orcs for a third time. Not much else is written about Gundabad, but we can assume that it was eventually reclaimed for good after the final defeat of Sauron. We will now move on to the dwarven city most prominently featured in The Hobbit. This is the city known as the Lonely Mountain, or in Sindarin, Erebor. Its prominence in The Hobbit and descriptions of its vast wealth and exquisite beauty make the fact that it is one of the youngest cities in Middle-earth all the more surprising. A proper dwarven city was not carved into the mountain until after Durin's folk were driven from Khazad-dûm by a Balrog sometime in the Third Age. The first halls were carved by Thrain I, and his people lived there for 200 years until his son Thorin I abandoned the mountain to join more of the refugees of Moria in the Grey Mountains. For almost 400 years, Erebor lay empty until dragons drove Thrain's son Thror and his people out of the Grey Mountains and back to the Lonely Mountain. For another 180 years, the dwarves continued to carve out the city under the mountain, which grew to be one of the richest kingdoms in Middle-earth. But these riches attracted the dragons they had run from, and soon the terrible antagonist of The Hobbit, that great worm Smaug, came knocking on Erebor's door. The events that followed in the Lonely Mountain's history are well documented in The Hobbit, but long story short, Bilbo Baggins and a company of dwarves sneak back into the city, the dragon is slain, a battle between 5 armies takes place, and yada yada yada, the mountain ends up under the rulership of the king of Durin's folk, named Dain. And so it is Dain who is king under the mountain at the time that the Lord of the Rings takes place. The climactic events of the Lord of the Rings take place far away from Erebor, so there isn't much material to draw from here, but Tolkien does mention that Sauron feared the power of Durin's folk, and sought to prevent them from aiding the men of Gondor and Rohan when he began his campaign. He first attempted to persuade the dwarves to help him in finding Bilbo Baggins and the One Ring. In return, he offered Dain 3 rings of power that had originally belonged to the Dwarf Lords. He made this offer twice, but each time Dain refused to even speak to the emissary of Sauron, and so the Dark Lord was resolved to destroy the Dwarven Kingdom, along with the city of Dale at the foothills of the Lonely Mountain. Around the same time that Sauron launches his assault on Gondor, his northern army of orcs and men from the east attack Erebor. This horde is too much even for the combined force of men and dwarves, and soon Dale is overtaken and sacked. The survivors retreat to the Lonely Mountain and are soon besieged. During the retreat, Dain and King Brand of Dale lead a rearguard to give time for others to make it to safety. King Brand is killed first, and Dain makes a heroic stand to defend the body of his friend from the enemy, but he too is eventually slain. However, they were able to buy enough time for their people, who are now safe behind Erebor's massive gates. Before the siege has drawn on for too long, the dwarves receive word that Sauron has been defeated and the One Ring has been destroyed. Inspired by this news, the dwarves and men stream out of the mountain and rout the besiegers. After the battle, the city of Dale is rebuilt, and the realm is safe and happy for the rest of time. I will mention that during the Fourth Age, many dwarves will leave Erebor to either help rebuild places damaged during the War of the Ring, or to establish new dwarven holds. One expedition goes to the next city we will discuss, and my personal favorite. That city is the greatest dwarven hold in all of Middle-earth, and arguably the greatest city to ever be built east of Valinor. It is of course the home of Durin's folk, also known as Khazad-dûm. Early on in the First Age of Middle-earth, Durin I wandered down from Mount Gundabad and came across a valley. This valley had a lake in it that was so calm that it reflected the night sky, and when Durin peered into it, he saw a ring of stars like a crown of sparkling jewels surrounding his head. He took this as an omen and decided that he would build his people's home in the caves above the valley. The dwarves soon began building the gates in the first hall, carving out the mountain as they went. They built a narrow bridge called Durin's Bridge across a large chasm, and on the far side they began construction of a city that outshone even Gondolin and Nargothrond. Even the elves in these far-off realms heard rumors from the east of this great dwarven mansion beneath the Misty Mountains. For the first 2,000 years or so, Khazad-dûm and the Longbeards were ruled by Durin the Deathless, until, ironically, he died. However, the dwarves believed that Durin would be reincarnated 7 times, and that the last Durin would lead the dwarves until their race faded away. So every time a dwarven prince is born who resembles Durin, he is named after him and is counted as one of the reincarnations. But for now, rulership of Khazad-dûm would pass to Durin's son, who we do not know the name of. During his reign, the dwarven hold would undergo a renaissance as the dwarves from the west fled the destruction of Beleriand. They settled in Khazad-dûm and greatly enhanced its splendor with their craftsmanship and artistry. As the city grew in beauty, it also grew in size, and before long it ran all through the Misty Mountains from east to west. It then became necessary to build a gate on the west side of the mountain, and this is the Doors of Durin I mentioned in the section on the elven city of Ost-in-Edhil. The Golden Age was further enhanced by the dwarves' relationship with the elves of Eregion in the west, and their position as a thoroughfare in which the elves could visit their kin in the east in Lothlorien. But this Golden Age was suddenly ended when Sauron sacked Ost-in-Edhil, while orcs simultaneously invaded Mount Gundabad. In response, the dwarves sealed off Khazad-dûm from the outside world. Despite having little to no contact with the other races, Khazad-dûm continued mining and smithing great pieces of armor, jewelry, and weapons. Its greatest treasure was the massive veins of incredibly rare mithril that flowed like rivers down the inside of the mountain. Over the course of thousands of years, the dwarves mined deeper and deeper in their greed to procure more mithril. Until nearly 2,000 years into the Third Age, they dug too deep and awoke a Balrog that had been hiding under the mountain since the defeat of Morgoth back in the First Age. This terrible being of flame and shadow killed the latest reincarnation of the Dwarven Father, Durin VI, and was thereafter named Durin's Bane. Being such an ancient and powerful demon, the Balrog forced the dwarves to flee their great city, which was afterward named Moria, or the Black Pit. For about 900 years, the Balrog reigned uncontested in the once home of the dwarves, and under his rule, orcs began spreading throughout the Misty Mountains. That was until the dwarves could bear the shame no longer and launched the War of the Dwarves and Orcs, which culminated in a great battle in the valley that Durin the Deathless had first dreamed of Khazad-dûm. While the orcs were soundly defeated in this battle, the Balrog remained too powerful for the dwarves to resist, and so their home remained in his hands as Moria. Nearly 100 years later, after the events of The Hobbit, an expedition was led by one of the dwarves who had accompanied Bilbo on his quest. This expedition successfully retook a large part of Moria and killed many orcs, but after only 5 years of restored dwarven rule, they were overrun and slaughtered by the orcs. It is unknown what Durin's Bane was doing at this time, and he is not mentioned at all in the accounting of the failed expedition. 25 years after the orcs retook Moria, the Fellowship of the Ring were forced to pass through the Black Pit during their quest. It is here that they are first set upon by the orcs, and then as they try to escape, Durin's Bane appears. Gandalf is forced to confront the Balrog, so that the rest of the Fellowship can escape, and in the ensuing battle, both the Balrog and Gandalf fall into a deep chasm. Their battle would continue even after the Fellowship leaves the mountains, believing that their friend had died, until finally Gandalf slayed the Balrog and rid Moria of its curse. But the orcs still remained in Khazad-dûm until the last king of Durin's folk, Durin VII, finally led an expedition to his ancestral home. The dwarves were successful in ridding the city of evil, and they remained there until the race fades from the world. Before we end our time with the dwarves, I want to do an honorable mention for one of the most beautiful and lesser-known dwarven holds in Middle-earth. It is lesser known because it wasn't founded until after the main events of The Lord of the Rings in the Fourth Age. Its location, however, is first mentioned in the Two Towers. During the Battle of Helm's Deep, the women and children of Rohan were hidden in caves located in the mountain that Helm's Deep is carved out of. Unfortunately, when the walls were breached by Saruman's explosive device, some orcs made their way towards the caves. They were intercepted by Gimli and a group of Rohirrim before they made it to the innocents that sheltered within. It is at this point that Gimli first lays eyes on the glittering caves of Aglarond and is immediately captured by their indescribable beauty. After the War of the Ring, Gimli returned to the glittering caves with a group of dwarves from Erebor, as well as his friend Legolas. The dwarves went to work expanding the caves and making it into one of the most majestic cities in Middle-earth. Gimli reigned as Lord of the Glittering Caves until he made the trip to Valinor with Legolas, never to return. And so finally we come to For the cities of men, we will begin much later than where we started with elves and dwarves. The second children of Iluvatar have always had it hardest in Middle-earth. Of the major races, they are the shortest lived and most easily corrupted by evil, leading elves and dwarves to at best pity them and at worst revile them. Despite all these factors working against them, men alone possessed the gift of imperfection, which is to say they were able to influence the world outside of the grand plan that Iluvatar had envisioned. Thus they were able to achieve great deeds that rivaled the other races. The first men, or Edain, had it tough from the get, and many were immediately corrupted by Morgoth upon awaking in the First Age. For this reason, large numbers of men served the Dark Lord during the War of the Elves and Morgoth. But there were a few great heroes of men who helped the elves in the Valar. These men were rewarded after the fall of Beleriand, with an island far west in the sea that separated Middle-earth from Valinor. This island was called Númenor, and would become the greatest kingdom of men to ever exist. In Númenor, there were a few towns and cities, but the largest and most impressive of these was the first city we will discuss in this section, the capital of Armenelos. The capital was located at the center of the island, and faced east towards Middle-earth. This was a subtle reminder to the men of Numenor that even though the Valar considered them to be greatest of all men, they were forbidden from sailing west to Valinor, and so would have to forever look east. The city itself was built with the help of the Maiar, sort of immortal spirit helpers of the Valar, and in the 32nd year of the Second Age, Elros, brother of Elrond, was crowned as the first king of Numenor and Armenelos. From this point onward, the power and majesty of the Númenóreans would grow and radiate out from their capital Armenelos. With the help of their longer-than-average lifespans, the city and the kingdom became the most wondrous since the destruction of Beleriand. They cultivated a deep friendship with the elves living in the west of Middle-earth, and brought the gift of knowledge to the lesser men that dwelled on the mainland. This golden era of peace could not last forever. In 1700 years into the Second Age, the war of the elves and Sauron had broken the tranquility. Sauron was seemingly unstoppable as he rampaged through the elven realm of Eregion, but just like in the final battle of the War of Wrath, the Edain of Numenor came to the aid of their elven brothers and helped push Sauron back to Mordor. This point was the zenith of the Númenóreans' honor and nobility. From here on, their power would continue to grow, but arrogance and resentment would slowly rot them from the inside. The Númenóreans resented that they had to die, while the elves were allowed to live forever, and they resented that they were allowed to live so close to the undying lands of the Valar, but could never set foot on the White Shores. This resentment made them easy prey for Sauron, who now knew that he could not easily defeat the combined might of men and elves by force, and instead would have to use trickery. So, 1500 years after the Númenóreans had initially defeated Sauron, they returned with a massive host to finish him off, but he quickly surrendered himself to the king as a prisoner. The king was easily convinced that it was his power that had made the Dark Lord so meek, and took him as a captive back to Armenelos. Once in the capital, Sauron went to work corrupting the men of Numenor, and promising that Morgoth held the key to eternal life, as long as they pledged their undying loyalty to him. Eager to gain what they believed the Valar wrongfully denied them, the Númenóreans built a massive temple to Morgoth in Armenelos. Soon after, they cut down the white tree that stood in the king's courtyard and burned it as a sacrifice. This white tree had been a gift from the elves and symbolized their friendship. Luckily, a seed was secretly saved by a young hero named Isildur, which would eventually grow into the white tree that was the emblem of Gondor. Opposed to the corruption that now spread like a cancer from Armenelos was a group of men led by Isildur's grandfather, Amandil. He led those that were still faithful to the Valar and rejected Sauron out of Armenelos. When the arrogance and heresy of the Númenóreans grew too great for the Valar to tolerate any longer, Armenelos and the rest of the island went the way of Beleriand and were sunk into the sea. Only Amandil's son, Elendil, and his followers survived as they escaped the calamity by sailing east to Middle-earth. On this journey, Elendil became separated from his sons Isildur and Anarion. They would land in two separate places in Middle-earth, and found the next few cities that we will discuss. First, Elendil landed in the northern region of Middle-earth, where he was greeted as a friend by the Elven High King Gil-galad. He later moved further east to the lands that had once belonged to the elven realm of Eregion, but was now populated by Númenórean exiles who had earlier fled the kingdom when Sauron began gaining influence. Elendil gathered these exiles together with his host of Dunedain and founded the city of Annúminas. This city would become the capital of the new Dunedain kingdom of Arnor. While Annúminas would never become as splendid as Armenelos, it did contain a few artifacts of the fallen kingdom and served its purpose as capital of the northern kingdom with dignity. For nearly 1,000 years, Arnor was ruled from Annúminas, until a succession crisis led the kingdom to be split in three. Annúminas was located in the new realm of Arthedain, but the capital was moved to a city called Fornost Erain. The degradation of Annúminas mirrored the gradual decline of the northern kingdoms, and by the time the realm was finally reunited, the city was nothing more than a ruin. Unique in respect to the cities we have discussed so far, the destruction of Annúminas was not sudden or permanent. 2,000 years after the last inhabitant of the city left, Aragorn, now King LOTR of the reunited kingdom, rebuilt Annúminas and once again made it the capital of the northern region of the Kingdom of Men. King LOTR spent a lot of time in Annúminas due to it being relatively close in proximity to the Shire, which allowed the king to visit his friends from the old days of the Fellowship. Jumping back in time, we will now discuss what happened to Elendil's sons after they were separated in the 3 cities they founded in the southern kingdom of Gondor. When the 2 sons landed in the south of Middle-earth, they made their way inland from the coast by following the river Anduin. As they came closer and closer to Mordor, in the lands of the east, the 2 brothers decided to split up. To the west of the Anduin, Anarion built his home in the shadow of the White Mountains. He named his stronghold Minas Anor. Meanwhile, Isildur made his way east from the river until he reached the mountains that separated Gondor from Mordor. Here he built a fortress, which he called Minas Ithil, and planted the seed he had saved since fleeing Annúminas. Minas Anor and Minas Ithil mean Tower of the Sun and Tower of the Moon, respectively. We will discuss the fate of each of these cities momentarily, but first I want to mention the 3rd city that the 2 brothers founded. This city was located between the 2 fortresses, astride the river Anduin. It was the capital of Gondor, where Isildur and Anarion ruled jointly, and it was named Osgiliath. Okay, now on to the story of Isildur's home, Minas Ithil. As I already mentioned, Minas Ithil was home to the White Tree of Gondor that Isildur had brought from Númenor. It also housed a mythical seeing stone called the Palantir that allowed Isildur to communicate with his brother and father across vast distances. Now, the original purpose of the city was to act as a bulwark between Gondor and the forces of evil that still dwelt in Mordor. The brothers believed that Sauron had perished in the fall of Annúminas, and so they were not prepared for a coordinated strike from Mordor. So when Sauron had regathered his strength, he led a surprise assault on the Tower of the Moon and quickly captured it. Isildur was able to flee the city, once again taking a seed from the White Tree to later be planted in Minas Anor. The city did not lay in the hands of the enemy for long, and after only a year, the last alliance of men and elves was able to recapture it on their way to besiege Sauron in his Tower of Barad-dûr. But with the death of Anarion during that siege, Minas Ithil would be relegated to a military outpost, and Isildur moved to Minas Anor. After most of the population of the city died during the Great Plague in the Third Age, the city remained empty except for a small garrison of troops who kept watch on Mordor. Later in the Third Age, the most terrible of Sauron's servants, the Witch King of Angmar, returned to the east and began plotting to take Minas Ithil. The garrison was able to hold the city for 2 years against the forces of the Witch King, but eventually the city fell and was transformed by the Nazgul into Minas Morgul, or the Tower of Dark Sorcery. Ever since then, the city was a constant thorn in the side of the kings of Gondor, as orcs and all manner of evil beings emanated out of it. After the War of the Ring and the fall of Sauron, King Elessar decided that the ground of Minas Morgul was too tainted by dark sorcery, and so the city was destroyed rather than retaken. So Minas Ithil never lived up to its potential, and had a pretty rough go of it. But what of its sister city, Minas Anor? Well, as I previously mentioned, after the first fall of Minas Ithil, the Tower of the Sun became home to the White Tree of Gondor, and unlike the Tower of the Moon, it grew in beauty and prosperity. However, it wasn't until 400 years after the first fall of Sauron that Minas Anor became anything more than a simple fortress. King Ostohur, descendant of Anarion, refashioned the city in the image of the great elven city of Gondolin, while still keeping Osgiliath as the capital of Gondor. But over time, Minas Anor would come to be more important than the city on the river, as Osgiliath slowly deteriorated. By the time Minas Ithil fell to the Witch King, Osgiliath was teetering on the edge of ruin, and so Minas Anor was rechristened Minas Tirith, or the Tower of Guard, and became the new capital. The city would not have long to revel in this new prestige, as shortly afterwards the last king of Gondor was killed by the Witch King, and the decline of Gondor truly began as rulership of the city passed to the stewards. For 25 generations, the stewards presided over the gradual dimming of the realm. By the time of the War of the Ring, it seemed like Minas Tirith was on the precipice of doom, as the forces of Mordor overran Osgiliath and threatened to take the last great city of men. Minas Tirith and the world's fate would be decided just outside the city in the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. All seemed to be lost when the great gates of Minas Tirith were breached by the sorcery-imbued battering ram named Grond. However, in the final hour, the riders of Rohan and the army of the dead led by Aragorn saved the city from certain destruction. After the War of the Ring and into the Fourth Age, the city was rebuilt and became even more wondrous than it had been in the old glory days. It stood until the end of the Age of Men as the capital of the reunited kingdom. I would like to close this bonus episode of History of Cities with a discussion on a very special place in the Lord of the Rings legendarium. This is the place where both the quests of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings begin, though it is not really a city. I am of course talking about the home of the Little Folk, also known as the Shire. Tolkien's world is filled with glorious cities that match the grandeur of his larger-than-life heroes that come from the major races of men, elves, and dwarves. But his greatest love seems to be for the little people who are at the center of his most popular works and the place they come from. Much in the way the hobbits are contrasted to the great races as rather humble and unassuming, the Shire is a quiet little realm when compared to the great cities. Despite its humility, the Shire is some place that anyone would like to live. It is far away from danger, and the simple life that the hobbits lead there is full of good food, good friends, and good times. While cities capture the imagination with epic tales of glory and heroes, as well as tragedy and sadness, the Shire evokes a certain yearning for a good, clean life away from the hustle and bustles that come with the splendor of magnificent cities. It is up to each reader on which type of life they prefer, but it is amazing that Tolkien is able to weave compelling depictions of both the quiet country village and the imposing grand city. I hope you have enjoyed this detour from our real-world narrative, and please join me next time as we return to the history of Byzantium.